The day they cast her out, the wind had teeth. Ilara was 20 years old. She stood on the porch of the house her father had built, the house where her mother had died, and watched Mr. Gable latch the gate. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the heavy brass lock, a new and gleaming thing that replaced the simple iron bolt her father had always used. Inside the house were her mother's linens, her father's books, and the ghost of her own childhood. Outside, there was only Ilara, a thin wool shawl, and the deed in her hand. It was a worthless piece of paper. Everyone in Providence Creek knew it. The deed granted her ownership of the condemned section of the tannery down by the creek, the crumbling lime pits, the collapsed drying sheds, and the old stone furnace building, which had been declared unsafe a decade ago. Mr. Gable, her father's partner, had been generous, the town whispered. He had forgiven her father's debts, which had mysteriously appeared in a ledger only after the funeral, and he had not thrown her out with nothing. He had given her the deed. It was a joke wrapped in legal paper. She had what was in her pockets, $3.12. She had the clothes on her back, a patched calico dress, worn leather boots, and the shawl. She had her father's axe, which she'd had the presence of mind to grab from the woodpile before Gable had finished his solemn, self-serving speech about duty and hard decisions. The axe was heavy, its hickory handle smooth and dark from her father's sweat. It felt like the only real thing left in the world. The community offered its condolences and its dismissals in equal measure. The pastor's wife suggested a position as a maid for a family 2 towns over. A kind woman, but her pity felt like a shroud. Brant, the trapper, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her boots. "A girl's got no business holding land," he'd grunted. "Sell the paper for a pittance and buy a ticket east." They all saw her as a problem to be solved, a stray to be shooed away. Their advice was a wall of whispers telling her to disappear. They expected her to fail. They expected her to break. But something in her had hardened in the last week, calcified by grief and betrayal. She would not take their charity. She would not run. She walked from the locked gate of her past to the one place in town that still bore her family's name, Gable's Mercantile. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful, mocking jingle. Gable stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar. He looked up, his expression a careful mask of sympathy. "Ilara," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "if you need credit for the stagecoach—" "I need a shovel," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the emotion that clawed at her throat. "A spade head, sturdy, and 10 pounds of salt." Gable's eyebrows rose. He exchanged a look with 2 ranchers standing by the stove. The corner of one man's mouth twitched. "A shovel?" Gable asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Planning on digging a garden at the old furnace?" The men chuckled. Ilara stared at him, her gaze so steady and cold that his smile faltered. She placed 2 of her $3 on the worn wood of the counter. She added the last of her coins. "And a bag of dried beans, whatever this will buy." He weighed out the beans with a sigh, the performance of a man burdened by the foolishness of others. She took her purchases, hefted the shovel head over her shoulder with the axe, and walked out without another word. She turned her back on the town, on its pity and its scorn, and walked toward the ruin by the creek. The journey was not long, but every step was a battle. The wind tore at her shawl, a physical thing that tried to push her back toward the false comfort of the town. The tannery sat slumped against a low, granite-faced hill, a skeleton picked clean by years of neglect. The smell hit her first, a faint, sour tang of old chemicals and rot, frozen into the air. The main drying shed was a rib cage of collapsed timbers. The lime pits were gaping wounds in the earth, crusted with gray-green ice. It was worse than she remembered. It was a place of death and decay. She stood before the furnace building. It was the only structure still mostly intact, a squat, powerful box of dark river stone built directly into the hillside. Its roof was a patchwork of holes, and the heavy oak door hung from a single rusted hinge. This was her inheritance. This was her home. A wave of despair so profound it made her physically sick washed over her. Her knees felt weak. The cold, which she had held at bay with anger, suddenly flooded her senses. The town was right. Gable was right. Brant was right. This was a tomb. Tears froze on her eyelashes, sharp and stinging. For a long, silent moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over. Then, something shifted. A gust of wind, stronger than the rest, slammed against the stone wall beside her. But where the wind shrieked over the open ground, here, against the stone, it was only a dull roar. The wall itself seemed to absorb the sound, to swallow the cold. She pressed her bare palm against the rough, dark granite. It was cold, yes, but it was a dry, solid cold. It was not the damp, seeping chill of the air. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she pushed her way through the broken door into the cavernous dark of the furnace building. Inside, the air was still. Utterly, profoundly still. The wind could not find its way in. The single large room was a disaster of rubble and debris, but the 4 stone walls were solid. At the back of the room, built into the hill itself, was the monstrous base of the main chimney. It was a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, where her father and grandfather had heated the great rendering vats. A river of fallen rock and soot choked the opening. As she stood there, in the gloom, she felt it. A draft. But it was not cold. It was a slow, almost imperceptible current of air moving up the chimney, and it was less cold. It was not warm, not yet, but it lacked the vicious bite of the air outside. She scrambled over the rubble, her hands raw on the sharp edges of fallen stone, and reached deep into the throat of the chimney. There, at the back, where the stone met the deep earth of the hill, it was different. The rock was cool, but not frozen. It held a deep, resonant neutrality, a latent energy. It was the geothermal breath of the earth itself, bleeding up through the deep-set foundation. The massive stone of the hill was a thermal battery, storing a faint but constant warmth from below. The worthless place had a secret, and in that moment, despair did not transform into hope. It transformed into something harder and more useful, grim, cold resolve. The work began. It was a war fought with a shovel and an axe. The first battle was against the debris. For 3 days, from the thin light of dawn until her muscles screamed in the twilight, she hauled rubble. She filled buckets with fallen mortar and shattered slate. She dragged out the nests of rats and the bones of small animals. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and cooking, were shredded. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving her palms raw and burning. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat and kept working. The pain was a constant companion, a fire in her hands that she learned to ignore. She separated the debris into piles: usable timber, shattered wood for kindling, stones for rebuilding, and dust to be cast away. The second battle was against the wind. The walls were solid, but the mortar had crumbled to dust in 1,000 places. She needed to seal them, to make the stone box airtight. She remembered her father mixing lime wash, the way he'd slaked the quicklime in pits. The old pits outside were full of the chalky residue. She found a deposit of thick, gray clay by the creek bed, hacking it out of the frozen ground with her axe. She hauled it back in buckets, her shoulders burning with the effort. In a salvaged iron tub, she mixed the clay with the lime powder and straw pulled from the rotted walls. It was a thick, heavy mortar, and she applied it with her bare, wrapped hands, forcing it into every crack and crevice. It was slow, agonizing work. Each sealed gap was a tiny victory against the cold. She worked her way around the room, a single foot of wall at a time, until the stone was a solid, unbroken shield. The roof was her greatest challenge. The original structure was too far gone. She needed to build a new one, smaller and stronger. Using the longest, straightest timbers she had salvaged, she laid out a low-angled frame. Cutting the notches for the joints with her father's axe was a lesson in patience and pain. Her first attempts were clumsy, the angles wrong. She would stare at her mistake, her body trembling with exhaustion, and then start again. She refused to fail. She learned the language of the wood, the way the grain would split, the force needed to make a clean cut. Slowly, painstakingly, a sturdy frame took shape. For the covering, she used large, flat slates she'd found in a pile behind the collapsed shed. Each one was heavy as a tombstone. She hauled them up a makeshift ramp, one by one, and laid them in overlapping rows, sealing each seam with her clay mortar. She saved the door for last. It was her gate against the world. She rebuilt the frame with solid timber, setting it deep into the stone. She rehung the original oak door, now reinforced with strips of iron she'd pried from old barrels. It closed with a deep, satisfying thud, the sound of security. For a window, she found a small, miraculously intact pane of thick glass in the wreckage of the foreman's office. She built a small, deep-set frame for it on the wall that faced south, angling it to catch the precious low arc of the winter sun. It was a single, clear eye looking out onto a hostile world. Her final task inside was the most important: the fire. The great chimney was too vast. A fire in it would suck all the warmth from the room. She needed to tame it. Using the best stones from her rubble pile and the fire bricks she'd found near the old boiler, she built a new, smaller fireplace and hearth within the massive opening of the old one. It was a piece of engineering born of pure necessity. The new fireplace was deep and narrow, designed to throw heat forward into the room. Its flue fed into the massive stone chimney, which now acted as a superheated thermal mass. When she finally lit the first fire, the smoke drew up the flue with a perfect, steady pull. The geothermal draft gave it life. The fire did not just heat the air, it poured warmth into the stone hearth, which held the heat for hours, long after the flames had died to embers. That first night, with the door barred and the fire crackling, she lay on a bed of pine boughs and wept. They were not tears of sadness or despair, but of a fierce, aching pride. The stone walls held the heat like a cupped hand. The wind howled outside, a beast locked out of her fortress. It could not touch her. She was still here. With the shelter secured, she turned to the other necessities of life. Water was first. The creek would soon freeze solid, but she remembered her father talking about the old tanner's well, sunk deep into the bedrock to provide the vast amounts of clean water the tanning process required. She found it under a collapsed section of roof, choked with leaves and ice. It took a full day to clear it. The well was lined with stone, and when she finally lowered a bucket, it came up with water so cold it felt sharp. It was a deep artesian spring, and because its source was far below the frost line, buffered by the same geothermal effect as her chimney, she knew it would never freeze. She built a heavy wooden cover for it, protecting her lifeline. Food was the next puzzle. The ground was frozen hard, but the old lime pits, sheltered by low stone walls, held a secret. Over the decades, they had filled with blown leaves, dust, and animal droppings, creating a deep layer of incredibly rich, black soil. The lime residue had neutralized the acidity, making it a perfect accidental garden bed. The slight warmth from the earth kept the deepest layers from freezing solid. Using the precious pane of glass from the foreman's office and several smaller, cracked pieces she salvaged, she constructed small, cold frames, low boxes that would act like miniature greenhouses. She planted the seeds she'd had the foresight to buy, though she hadn't known why at the time: hardy kale, turnips, and onions. It was a desperate gamble against the season, but inside her stone-walled, glass-topped pits, shielded from the worst of the wind and kissed by the faint warmth from below, it was a gamble that might just pay off. She needed protein. She needed something other than beans. She needed animals. That meant a trip back to town. She spent 2 days gathering every piece of scrap iron and copper she could find on the property: old pipes, broken tools, copper wiring. She bundled it onto a crude sled she fashioned from barrel staves and hauled it to the blacksmith. He was a fair man and gave her a decent price. With the coins heavy in her pocket, she walked once more to Gable's Mercantile. Her entrance silenced the store. She was a different woman from the one who had left weeks before. Her face was thinner, etched with new lines of resolve. Her hands were calloused and scarred. She was covered in a fine layer of stone dust and soot that seemed to have become part of her skin. She walked directly to the counter. Mr. Gable stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The mockery in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of disbelief. "I need 3 laying hens, a rooster, and 1 of your piglets," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. She counted out the coins onto the counter. "And a 50-pound sack of feed." A ripple of incredulous laughter went through the men gathered by the stove. It was Brant, the trapper, who spoke first. "What's the Tannery girl gonna do with chickens?" he sneered, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Gonna raise 'em in a pit?" The men laughed again. Gable recovered his composure, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's your money, Alara." He sold her the animals, making a show of catching the flighty hens and boxing the squealing piglet. He knew, and everyone in the store knew, that she was throwing her money away. No one could keep livestock alive through a Providence Creek winter without a proper barn and a mountain of hay. Leading a piglet on a rope and carrying a crate of chickens, she walked out of the store and back to her ruin, the sound of their laughter following her like a curse. She built a pen for the chickens and the pig in a sealed-off corner of the furnace building. The animals shared the warmth of the stone and the fire. Their body heat added to the small ecosystem she was creating. The hens, confused but safe, began to lay eggs within a week. The small, perfect ovals felt like jewels in her palm. They were a promise. They were life. It was a few nights later that the dog appeared. He was a gaunt, gray creature with scarred ears and wary eyes, drawn by the smell of the pig and the scent of the small rabbit she'd managed to snare. He kept his distance at first, a shadow at the edge of the firelight. Ilara saw not a threat, but a fellow outcast. She left a bowl of scraps for him by the door. He would not take it while she watched, but in the morning the bowl was clean. This became their ritual. Slowly, over days, he came closer. One evening, as a bitter wind rattled the door, he whined softly. She opened it, and he slipped inside, immediately curling up on the far side of the hearth, as far from her as he could get, while still feeling the warmth. She called him Soot, for his dark coat and his appearance from the ashes of her old life. He became her guard, her companion, her silent witness. His low growl at any unfamiliar sound was a comfort deeper than any words. He was the final piece of her new world. The town settled on a name for her. Brant the trapper had coined it, and it stuck. Tannery Girl. Sometimes, when they were feeling particularly cruel, it was the Pit Witch. The stories grew more fanciful with each telling. She was living in filth, eating rats. She had gone mad with grief and solitude. Mr. Gable encouraged the talk, shaking his head sadly whenever her name was mentioned, speaking of the tragedy of a young mind gone astray. It cemented his own image as a patient, benevolent man, and it pushed Elara further into the wilderness of their minds, a cautionary tale for their children. Once, Brant made a special trip out to her property. He stood 100 feet from her door, watching her split firewood with a steady, rhythmic swing of her father's axe. Soot stood beside her, the fur on his back ridged, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "That fire won't last you till the deep freeze, girl," Brant shouted, his voice full of derisive confidence. "You'll be beggin' for a spot by my stove come January." Elara didn't stop her work. She simply set the next log, raised the axe, and brought it down with a clean, sharp crack. The sound of the splitting wood was her only answer. He eventually grew tired of the one-sided conversation and left, spitting on the ground as he went. Deep winter arrived. The world outside her stone walls shrank and hardened. Her life fell into a simple, powerful rhythm. Wake in the dark. The air in the room would be cool, but the stone walls still radiated a deep, gentle warmth from the previous night's fire. She would add wood to the embers, coaxing the flames back to life. The smell of wood smoke, the sound of the crackling fire. Tend the animals. Their soft noises in the corner of the room were a constant reassurance. Collect the eggs, a daily miracle. Milk the nanny goat she had traded for with a passing tinker, using salted fish as currency. Water from the unfrozen well. The journey to the well was the most dangerous part of her day, a brief, violent exposure to the elements. Then back to the warmth. Tend the cold frames. Brushing snow from the glass, the sight of the green kale leaves inside was an impossible, vibrant defiance of the white, dead world. The rest of the day was for work. Mending clothes, sharpening the axe, weaving a rug from salvaged rope and rags, planning her resources. She was utterly alone, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of a small, warm, functioning kingdom of stone and fire. The world tested her kingdom with smaller trials before the great one. An early, wet snowstorm turned to a deluge of freezing rain, coating everything in a thick, heavy shell of ice. She heard the crack and groan of trees in the distance, their branches snapping under the weight. But her low-pitched slate roof, solidly mortared, held fast. The ice sealed her fortress even tighter. Later, a pack of hungry wolves, gaunt and desperate, were drawn by the scent of her pig. They circled the furnace building for a whole night, their howls a lament of hunger just outside the walls. Soot stood sentry at the door, his barking a furious, constant challenge. The solid oak and iron held. The wolves could not get in. They were a force of nature, but she had built her world inside another, older force of nature, the stone of the hill. Each test she passed solidified her resolve. Her systems worked. She was ready. The great freeze did not arrive like a storm. It did not come with wind and snow. It was a presence. It descended on Providence Creek like a judgment. The sky turned a pale, luminous gray, and the air grew so still and so cold it felt solid. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero, then 20, then 30. It stayed there. The world became brittle. Trees exploded with a sound like rifle shots as the sap inside them froze and expanded. The creek turned to blue-black iron. It was a cold that felt ancient and personal, a cold that seeped through wood and chinking and confidence. It was a cold that killed. In Providence Creek, the community's preparations, adequate for any normal winter, collapsed. Log homes, the pride of the frontier, became iceboxes. The cold leached the heat out faster than they could burn their wood. chimneys, contracting in the brutal freeze, cracked and failed. The great stone fireplace in the town meeting hall, a symbol of civic pride, developed a fissure that filled the room with smoke, rendering it useless. Firewood, stockpiled for months, was consumed in weeks. Families abandoned their larger homes, crowding into single rooms, stuffing rags into the gaps in their walls. But the cold was a relentless thief. It found every crack. Livestock, left in barns that were now no better than open sheds, began to die. The sounds of the town were muffled by the dense air. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer was gone. The laughter of children was gone. All that remained was the howl of hungry dogs and the sharp, percussive crack of freezing wood. The town's confidence shattered like a pane of glass. Inside Ilara's tannery hold, it was another world. The great freeze pressed against her stone walls, and the stone did not yield. The geothermal warmth from the earth, faint but constant, created a buffer. The cold had to fight its way through tons of granite that was actively, if slowly, resisting it. Her fire burned steadily in the efficient hearth, its heat pouring into the surrounding stone, which radiated it back into the room as a constant, enveloping warmth. The air was warm enough that she could work in a single layer of wool. Her animals were calm, insulated by stone and straw. Her well provided clean, liquid water. Her tiny garden under the glass, benefiting from the warm earth beneath, continued to produce dark green leaves. She was not fighting the freeze. She was living outside its reach. She had built an island of warmth and life in an ocean of crystalline death. The silence in her home was one of peace, not fear. The arrival came in the dead of night, at the height of the freeze. It was not a knock, but a frantic, desperate pounding on her door. Soot erupted in a frenzy of barking, a sound so violent it seemed to shake the small room. Ilara grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs. The pounding came again, weaker this time, followed by a slumping sound. "Help!" a voice rasped, the word cracking in the frozen air. "For the love of God, help us!" She recognized the voice. It was Brant, the trapper, the man who had mocked her, who had named her Tannery Girl. She slid the heavy bar from the door and cracked it open. He fell inside, a wreck of a man covered in snow and frost. His face was a mask of dead white frostbite, his beard a tangle of ice. He collapsed onto her floor, sobbing with pain and relief. He looked at her, his eyes wild with terror. "My boy," he choked out. "It's my boy. He's sick. The lung fever. Our chimney. It cracked. The cabin is full of smoke and colder than a grave. We're freezing to death, Ilara. We're dying." He had come to her. He had walked 2 miles through the killing cold, to the one place he had scorned, because he had remembered seeing the steady, unwavering plume of smoke rising from her chimney. He had come to the pit witch for salvation. Ilara looked down at the man who had been her chief tormentor. For a fleeting second, she felt the bitter satisfaction of his humiliation. She remembered his laughter in the store, his shouted insults across the snow. She looked at her woodpile, so carefully rationed. She thought of her food stores, measured out to last until spring. Helping him would cost her. It would put her own survival at risk. But then she looked at his face, no longer a mask of arrogance, but of a father's raw terror. She saw not the mocker, but a man at the absolute end of his rope. The choice was not a choice. It was an inevitability. She was not him. She would not let a child die. She gave Brant a mug of hot broth, forcing him to drink it slowly. The warmth brought a flicker of life back to his eyes. Then she began to move. She pulled on her heaviest coat and boots. She loaded the crude sled she had built with a canvas sack full of split, dry oak, her best wood. She added 2 of her thickest blankets. From her stores, She took a jar of preserved vegetables, a dozen eggs, and a small sack of flour. This was a significant portion of her wealth, the currency of her survival. She was giving it away. With Soot at her side, his presence a dark, steady warmth, she stepped out into the brutal, soul-crushing cold. She followed Brant back into the storm, a journey into the heart of the freeze to save the family of the man who had wished for her demise. When they returned hours later, with Brant's wife and feverish son bundled on the sled, the trapper's shock was a palpable thing. As he stepped from the lethal cold into the steady, enveloping warmth of her home, he stopped dead. He stared. He expected a hovel, a smoky, foul-smelling cave. He saw a clean, orderly room, bathed in the golden light of the fire. He saw the chickens clucking softly in their clean straw pen. He saw the piglet, fat and healthy, sleeping in the corner. His gaze fell upon the small green plants growing under the glass near the wall, a patch of impossible summer in the heart of the Ice Age. The air did not smell of filth, it smelled of wood smoke and baking bread from the flour she had just ground, and the faint, clean scent of the pine boughs on her bed. He looked at the neatly stacked firewood, the organized shelves of preserved food, the mended tools hanging on the wall. He could not reconcile this reality with the story the town had told, the story he himself had championed. More people came. Brant's rescue was a signal fire. The first was Mr. Gable's wife, her face hidden in a thick scarf, her pride a visible, painful burden. She did not ask for shelter, only for firewood. Her husband, she admitted in a whisper, had miscalculated. Their vast woodshed was empty. Ilara said nothing. She simply helped the woman load a sled. Then came the blacksmith's family, their youngest child's cough, a terrible, rattling sound in the still air. She took them in, settling them on the far side of the hearth. Soon her small stone room held 3 families, a silent, huddled collection of the town's most confident citizens, now reduced to grateful refugees. Finally, Mr. Gable himself appeared. He stood in the doorway, not daring to step inside. The brutal cold billowed in around him. He was a man diminished, his authority stripped away by the sheer, implacable fact of the freeze. He looked at the people he was supposed to lead, sheltered by the girl he had dispossessed. He looked at her warm, orderly home, built from the scraps he had thrown her. His gaze met Ilara's. The shame in his eyes was absolute. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tried again, his voice a dry croak. "We were wrong," he said, the words torn from him. "I was wrong." He looked around the room, at the impossible evidence of her triumph. "We called you Tannery girl. My God, we were the fools." Ilara felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her. This was her moment of victory, the vindication she had earned with broken hands and an aching back. She could have said anything. She could have reminded him of his false ledger, of the locked gate, of the town's laughter. But she did none of these things. Her victory was not in their defeat, but in her own survival. Her grace was her final, unassailable fortress. She simply nodded toward her woodpile. "There is wood," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Take what you need for your family." She turned and offered a bowl of hot soup to the blacksmith's sick child. Her actions spoke with a power no words of triumph ever could. When the great freeze finally broke, it left Providence Creek a changed town. It was humbled, wounded. They had been proud of their frontier toughness, but the freeze had revealed their fragility. They had built their homes and lives on convention, and convention had failed them. The immediate aftermath was a period of quiet awe directed at Ilara. The name Tannery Girl vanished from their vocabulary, replaced with a respectful, almost fearful, Mistress Ilara. People did not come for charity anymore. They came for knowledge. They came with questions about mortar, about stone construction, about cold frames and flue design. They came to learn how she had survived when they had almost perished. Mr. Gable was a broken man. His authority, built on wealth and shrewdness, evaporated overnight. No one sought his counsel anymore. They sought Ilara's. A week after the thaw, he walked out to the tannery, not with a swagger, but with the slow, tired gait of an old man. He handed her a new deed, legally drawn and witnessed by the circuit judge. It gave her full, unencumbered title to the entire tannery property, including the sections he had kept for himself. "It was always your father's," he said, not meeting her eye. "The debt was a lie." Ilara took the deed and simply nodded. She did not need his confession. She had already built her own justice. The Great Freeze became a scar on the town's memory, but also a lesson. New structures in Providence Creek were built differently. Foundations were dug deeper. Stone was used not just for decoration, but for its thermal mass. Cellars were not just for storage, but for shelter. The lessons learned in Ilara's furnace room were slowly etched into the architecture of the town itself. Her home, which came to be known as the Tannery Hold, became a landmark, a testament to what could be built from what was discarded. Travelers passing through heard the story and carried it with them. A tale of the young woman who had tamed a ruin and faced down the deadliest winter in memory. Years passed. Ilara remained at the hold. It grew, not in size, but in richness. An orchard of hardy apple trees now grew in the shelter of the old tannery walls. Goats and sheep grazed on the hillside. The furnace building remained the warm, beating heart of the homestead, but new, smart structures had grown up around it. A greenhouse with many panes of glass, a stone-walled barn, a small smokehouse. She never married. Her life was her own, complete and sufficient. Soot, now gray around the muzzle and slow in his step, was a constant shadow at her side. She was no longer an outcast, but she remained a part, the quiet, unshakable center of the community she had saved. They respected her solitude as much as they respected her strength. One autumn evening, she stood on the hill above her home, watching the sun set behind the distant peaks. The air was crisp with the coming cold, but it held no fear for her. She looked down at the collection of stone and slate and glass she had built with her own two hands. It was more than a shelter. It was a life. It was a testament to the simple, profound idea that true strength is not the power to conquer, but the resilience to endure. And that the greatest victory is not in proving your enemies wrong, but in having the grace to offer them a seat by your fire when they finally come knocking on your door, shivering in the cold.